This is TV 10 and 55 Focus, a program dealing with issues affecting everyone on Long Island and the tri-state area. Now your host, Richard Rose.
Hi, I'm Richard Rose, and welcome to Focus. Today it is our pleasure to have as our guest Larry Levy. He is the Executive Dean for the National Center for Suburban Studies at Hofstra University. Welcome to the show. Thanks. Too late to say Happy New Year since I haven't seen you?
No, never too late to say Happy New Year. You can say it in
March
April if
might
you want.
be. No, okay.
Right?
Well, then I'll hold you to that. But of course, with the new year, still the same old topic. We're talking about politics.
Absolutely.
And we start with the national landscape, where we are now approaching the New Hampshire primary after a neck-and-neck race, a virtual dead heat. May even wind up that Rick Santorum won it because there's some pressure now to recount where there was a claim of an undercount for him or an overcount for Mitt Romney. But Mitt Romney winning in Iowa, the Iowa caucus, by 8 votes. So let's start there, talking about that and when we get to our national landscape. But then there's more beyond that. There is what happened here in the state of New York. We have our new governor, Andrew Cuomo, now giving his second State of the State address. And here are some of the things that he promised as he talked to New Yorkers just this past week.
And we provided a middle-class tax cut for the lowest rate in 58 years.
If Governor Andrew Cuomo was in the mood to boast about his accomplishments in his first year, enthusiastic lawmakers who joined him in lowering the tax rate to levels not seen since 1953 heartily applauded the achievement. With the use of overhead graphics, the governor joked that 58 years ago he hadn't even been born yet, and that Majority Leader Dean Skelos and Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver were just youngsters looking forward to the day when they'd work in bipartisan harmony. As to the year ahead, the governor pledged billions to rebuild or replace hundreds of bridges and roads while building an energy highway to create jobs. He proposed building the country's largest convention center in Queens at Aqueduct Raceway, next to the new Resorts World Casino, and then called for a constitutional amendment to allow statewide casino gambling.
It is not a question of whether or not we should have gaming in the state. We have gaming in the state of New York. We have tribal casinos all across the state. We have racinos all across the state.
Governor Cuomo went on to detail other big-ticket items, including $1 billion in aid for the economically depressed city of Buffalo, $200 million more in regional economic aid that Long Island's hoping to get a big share of. He again called for public financing of political campaigns and for creating a new reduced public pension tier to lower government obligations to fund those pensions. The governor will also appoint a bipartisan commission to try to improve teacher accountability and student academic performance.
I learned that everyone in education has a lobbyist. I am not kidding.
Little jab there from the governor at many of the unions and lobbyists that are constantly trying to get his ear and protect their own turf.
Right. Well, he went on to say that I am going to be the students' lobbyist.
Exactly. You were there for the speech, were you not?
My 27th.
So you've seen quite a few of these. How would you say it stacked up?
I'd say this is one of the better speeches. Andrew Cuomo may not be the soaring orator that his dad was, but he's really, really effective, and he blends both vision and expertise with humor. And I mean, he had the place, and Albany is not a place that laughs a lot.
Dean
but
Skelos.
He had them in stitches. He
was
had
in
them
stitches. But Sheldon Silver, was that a smile? I wasn't really sure.
Oh, absolutely. These guys were laughing. These guys were absolutely laughing. And even if they didn't want to laugh, they would have laughed, because Andrew Cuomo is, I mean, he's not an 800-pound gorilla. He's a 2,000-pound gorilla up there. And these guys know that the sudden reversal in their approval ratings, in public confidence, is due almost entirely to Andrew Cuomo's soaring approval ratings. Well, they like being seen as something other than dysfunctional dolts.
They're like comparing themselves to Washington as having gotten something done in stark contrast right now.
Exactly. So they're gonna laugh at Andrew's jokes even if they don't like them.
Well, everybody wants to be loved rather than hated, and the polls are often frustrating and disappointing for any elected official when they see what low regard they're held in. Right. Will this continue, though?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it's the most important question. The biggest accomplishment in 2011, and there were a lot of individual pieces of legislation, gay marriage, property tax cap, a whole bunch of things that were done. But the biggest overall accomplishment was restoring a degree of public confidence in government, of reducing the level of cynicism, which was so high that it was preventing anything from getting done. The public didn't believe that politicians were acting in their interest, and wouldn't support even things that were necessary. Suddenly it's 2012, and we have a legislature and a governor that is held in, if not the highest regard, certainly higher regard. And it's keeping this increase in public confidence high is the most important task of 2012.
Well, you know, it was shocking how they were able to kind of keep secret the grand deal they were working on right at the end of the year there. I think it took everyone off guard. Do you know anything more about how that all came together?
The Cuomo administration had been talking to Genting, which is a Malaysian-based gambling organization that has casinos all over the world and which operates the Racino at Aqueduct. And it made sense to the Cuomo administration that if you're going to have one company there with deep pockets, why not give them the added inducement of building a convention center at a site that had the land? The problem is that it's just the kind of deal, even if it's a good idea, that can make people start to think, wait a second, is there something going on here? Why the secrecy? What about public bidding? It may, in hindsight, the Cuomo administration may come to look at this as a mistake in terms of public relations.
Well, is it just Genting that can have such a, is this idea only good for Aqueduct and can only be then?
Well, once the state passes a constitutional amendment, which the soonest it could happen would be 3 years, that would allow casino gambling, then the free market comes into play. At racetracks, though, the state owns the racetracks. The state owns Aqueduct. Well, the New York Racing Association owns it, but might as well be the state. Aqueduct, Belmont. What this means for Long Island is that Belmont will not get a casino.
There's no way you'll get a great disappointment to some of the folks in Nassau County and the Shinnecocks, I would think.
Yes, the Shinnecocks were hoping, once they were rebuffed at the Nassau Coliseum site, to be able to get into Belmont. But that was always a long shot because Belmont was outside the 75-mile distance from the reservation where they're allowed to extend their sovereignty. Belmont would have required a lot of approvals from a lot of people who were never going to give it because they're working to build a casino a few miles down the Cross Island at Aqueduct.
Do you think that gambling this constitutional amendment even has a chance?
Yes, I think the constitutional amendment has a good chance, especially if the governor's approval rating remains high and he's pushing it, especially if there's not a lot of legislative opposition. You will get opposition from the Catholic Church. You will get from some good government groups, economic groups that see it as fool's gold, that it's not a way of creating new wealth, it's just spreading it around in different ways, and may cost people in the lower socioeconomic levels more than it gets them.
Some people say this is a warm-up for 2016 and Governor Cuomo's presidential White House ambitions.
Well, when we were talking before the show, we both used the expression State of the Union.
Accidentally,
because,
it felt like it.
I don't know if that's a Freudian slip, that 4 years from now Andrew Cuomo will be doing it. But, Andrew Cuomo is very aware of how far it is to 2016, and that he will have no chance of being considered by people outside of New York for a presidential run if he doesn't succeed right at home. And he had one great year, and his big challenge overall is to have people not look at 2011 as a 1 year, a freak aberration, and that he was a 1 year wonder.
Well, we'll certainly find out. There are some areas that there's going to be friction with Republicans over tenant protection, the fact that there wasn't mandate relief specifically spelled out.
Assembly Democrats won't want to do the Tier 6.
The Tier 6 will turn off a lot of the union and government workers.
Right.
These are battles yet ahead, but we'll have time to cover them. When we return right here on Focus, we'll talk with Larry Levy about the presidential race on the Republican side. Stay with us.
TV 10 and 55 Focus now continues.
Welcome back. I'm Richard Rose here with our guest Lawrence Levy, known to us as Larry Levy from Hofstra University, Executive Dean of the National Center for Urban Studies, which means you study places like Long Island, Westchester, Rockland. You know these areas back and forth, but you also know the national political scene. And that's what we want to talk about. We have some video right here that shows now who are the three front runners in the New Hampshire primary coming up, I believe, this Tuesday. And we already see Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum and Ron Paul. Ron Paul in second place, but Rick Santorum surging into double digits now. But Mitt Romney has had a 40% share of that primary for months now. So what do you see shaping up here after the razor-thin victory, if it was, in Iowa for Mitt Romney over Rick Santorum?
Well, New Hampshire's about second and third place. There's no question that Mitt Romney is going to win in New Hampshire. He was the governor of Massachusetts, and a good portion of New Hampshire is literally a suburb of Boston. And in fact, for the people who used to say, why does anybody care about Iowa and New Hampshire? They're not at all like the rest of the country. Well, that may be true of Iowa to a good extent, but New Hampshire has some significant suburban areas, and as we've talked about on this show, it's the suburbs that will decide who wins the presidency and who will control Congress.
You mean that ultimately, in the actual November election?
That's right.
And everybody fights for that turf,
right.
Both the Democrats too. And I noticed President Obama, even in the middle of this nonstop Republican headlines, because he's unopposed, he tries to inject himself even on the days of the results. You'll see some news conference or some announcement, and he's coming back from his trip from Hawaii, I believe, on that day.
Right. Well, what he tries to do is float above the fray and rain down upon them.
Because he's still the target of all of them, even when they're done taking shots at each other.
Sure, and he can't completely go off the air because he is having shots taken at him. And if you don't refute a negative charge, a negative statement, it begins to stick, even if it's just coming from Republicans.
Well, right now there's plenty of time for them to take on each other because somebody wants to emerge as the ultimate nominee, and it's still a wide open field, is it not?
I don't think it. I personally don't think it is.
You believe it's Mitt
And
Romney,
I know I'm starting to edge into an area where I don't like to be, which is reading my own crystal balls that are sometimes cracked. But after Romney, for much of the campaign, was not expected to do very well and did not campaign in Iowa. He saw an opening with the fracturing of the conservative religious vote. He went after it, won, and whether he wins by 8 or loses by 8, he's the victor there. So we always knew he was going to win New Hampshire. So he comes out with the momentum of having won the first 2 contests. And the last poll that I just saw out of South Carolina shows him winning in that state too.
Which is a bit of a surprise because, no question that New Hampshire Republicans would be considered liberal by most standards in the southern states. And so you would expect a different brand of candidate to succeed in South Carolina than in New Hampshire.
Well, South Carolina's Republican population is a little bit more cosmopolitan than people give it credit. I've been down there. I was down there for a South Carolina primary. You do have a heavy religious conservative faction there. And in fact, again, like it was in Iowa, it's right now being fragmented. But you also have mainstream Republican businessmen, Main Street, Wall Street types. It has a diverse economy. So there is a chance for a moderate to reach the 35% mark. And if everybody else is fragmented, Romney could win in the low 30s.
Because in the end, you just got to get enough delegates, which I believe is about 1,450 or somewhere in there.
Right, and even if Romney loses in South Carolina, finishes second or even third, then you've got 187 delegates up for grabs between then and Super Tuesday in early March. And to get those delegates, you need money and you need manpower, and you need a message that appeals to a more moderate, mainstream Republican constituency. And the only person out there who's got that is Romney. And I just don't, and once you get to Super Tuesday, he's the only person out there, except Rick Perry, who has the money and manpower to compete. And by then, Rick Perry's going to be gone.
Well, you would think by now, though, he would have already garnered this sort of momentum where people would gather around him. There's still these reservations about him being a Mormon, although many of them people won't say it publicly, but clearly in the South, evangelicals have long had a distrust for Mormons, regarding it as a cult, in fact.
And that's one of Romney's biggest problems in the general election. Not that those voters, the evangelicals, will vote for Barack Obama, but that they will, as they did for George Bush in 2000, that they will stay home.
Well, that's where you would think there'd be an opportunity for someone like a Rick Santorum, who's just, was off the radar, was getting 1%, 2%, 3% in most polls,
barely above Michelle Bachmann's range or John Huntsman's range. Michelle Bachmann dropping out, Rick Perry hanging on along with John Huntsman. That may change in the next couple of weeks. But you would think that would be the opportunity for Rick Santorum, who would say, look, I've been vetted, I've been through this before. There are no skeletons in my closet. There aren't going to be any scandals that come up. Other than the fact that you might not agree with him, he says he's a solid, true red meat conservative.
He's a red meat religious conservative. And right now, all of his support is coming from the Christian right. Nothing wrong with that, but it has a limited ceiling. And he is so far out of the mainstream on a number of social issues, whether you agree with him or not, that I just don't see him appealing to the typical moderate suburban swing voter around the country. I think that he's going to tap out at a pretty low level. But you can't write him off because he does have the reputation as being one of the hardest workers in politics. He's a good-looking guy. He's fairly well-spoken. The problem is what comes out of his mouth when he speaks. And he made a remark recently about black people and welfare that was so outrageous. It hasn't gotten the attention that it might because we're still locked in a Republican primary where there almost are no black voters. But it is going to haunt him during the general election, and it is going to electrify black voters to come out again for Barack Obama when people were worrying that they wouldn't if Rick Santorum is the candidate.
And what happens to Ron Paul?
Ron Paul's is a niche candidate who, if you saw the recent interview with him, I forget which network, doesn't expect that he's going to win. He has a mixed, eclectic bag of positions that make it hard to figure out what he is. He's a libertarian. He could find a home in the nether reaches of the Democratic Party, just as he finds a home in the nether reaches of the Republican Party.
Could you see him getting a post in some Republican administration if they were to win the White House?
Probably not. And I'm not sure he wants it. I think he likes being out there. You know,
he's 76 years old.
And he's 76 years old.
Run
and
a bunch of times
his
now.
son is the heir apparent.
Right.
Rand Paul is the heir apparent to the Paul legacy.
All right, when we return, we're going to talk about some of the Long Island politics. There have been some big events. The election of Suffolk County Executive Steve Bellone, a Republican taking over in Islip, an old hand returning in Babylon. What does it all mean? Larry Levy will help us sort it out when we return right here on Focus.
TV 10 and 55 Focus continues.
And welcome back. Larry Levy here with us from Hofstra University. And we have a new Suffolk County Executive, Steve Bellone. Your take on that? His start, how does he already started things off?
He started off strongly. He has tried to project an aura of being a fiscal conservative, which is how he ran for office. But he's also, particularly as evidenced in where he chose to be inaugurated, in Brentwood, the heart of the Latino community of Long Island. And obviously, if for anybody at least who followed Suffolk County, the prior county executive, Steve Levy, got into a lot of controversy with the Latino community. Whether you agreed with his positions or not, it was a point of contention. And Steve Bellone has decided to do things differently.
Yeah, and he also came with a strong speech about what he stands for. But some of the specifics were laid aside because they really don't know what they're facing, do they?
Well, I think they do know what they're facing, and which we're really saying the same thing. I think they do know what they're facing, and it is so immense that it overwhelms any effort to just identify one little thing or another little thing. There's no room for broad and new initiatives except, unfortunately, cutting.
Because we're looking at if the worst scenarios at least outlined, and sometimes these can be even worse than one imagines.
$100 million, $200
million,
$300 million. We do not know where the bottom is.
So here do you have a situation where Steve Bellone is standing and comparing himself in stark contrast to Steve Levy's approach, wind up doing the same things that Steve Levy talked about doing, closing the Foley nursing home, eliminating hundreds of county workers and demanding great concessions, especially in paying more for health care. Is that what he ultimately will be forced to do anyway?
When you run a campaign where you have very, very few positions, hard positions, you do leave yourself some wiggle room when you get in. But the downside of that is that you haven't created a mandate for any particular tough action. So Steve Bellone is going to have to tread very, very carefully in taking these tough positions. The legislature, which did not want to close the Foley home, which does not want to do some of the austerity measures that Steve Levy and Steve Bellone will have to do, can say very easily, we all ran for office and won by big numbers, and we weren't talking about that. We didn't see your vote as a mandate to do those things. So he may have tough going. But the numbers are so big, Richard, that everybody will eventually have to come to the table and do some very, very tough things.
Meanwhile, you have Richie Schaefer. That's how everybody knows him, Richie Schaefer, since he's been young, practically. He's always been Richie.
That's right.
And he is now back in as the Babylon town supervisor, and at least for now, an interim position. And he's maintaining his job as the head of the Suffolk County Democratic Party. He's one of the people who helped propel Steve Bellone to his ultimate success, and now is replacing him, yet he's keeping the hat as Suffolk County Democratic chair party, head of the party. Newsday raising some issues about whether it's appropriate for him to keep both jobs.
Well, I think Newsday was fully justified in raising those questions. Richie Schaefer is one of the greatest local political leaders I have ever seen. He has, strengthened the Democratic Party. He's recruited great candidates. He's a terrific fundraiser. His counsel is sought by politicians around the country. He also was a pretty good supervisor when he was the head of Babylon Town before Steve Bellone was.
So they're trading jobs here.
Well, they are. It's kind of going back to the future.
Right.
The problem is holding both jobs, as you alluded to. There was a time when, maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, when it was not uncommon for the Democratic or Republican leader in a town or the county to also hold an elected position. Times have changed. The ethics laws, transparency, what the public will tolerate and what they won't, has made doing both very different. You can not break the law, not break any ethical mores as a political leader, and do things that are going to hurt you as an elected official.
Could put him in conflict with fellow Democrats, too, when Steve Bellone has to outline some difficult choices that maybe they don't want to go along with. But we have only a few minutes left. Let's talk a little bit about Islip, where some battles look like they're looming ahead. You had Tom Croce take Phil Nolan's place.
This is if the Republican Party makes a major comeback in New York State. In other words, they come back to the era of George Pataki and as a governor and controlling, as well as controlling the Senate and controlling most of the towns and counties in the state. You may be able to say that it started in Islip, because that's what happened in 1991.
Why do you feel that might be the
Because
place?
the only way that the Republican Party can revive itself statewide is by winning back the Republican-leaning villages and towns and counties where they've been losing in the last 10 years.
Well, Tom Croce saying he would lower property taxes there. That was part of his campaign pledge. But now he's uncovering the fact that what every township and level of government is facing, emerging deficits. It could be $20, $30 million is the numbers that are being kicked around. Is he going to be able to fulfill his campaign pledge?
Well, the short answer is probably, but at what cost? In other words, will he do it with borrowing? Will he do it by moving money around just to be able to keep a pledge? Will he cut essential services that'll make him unpopular the next time he has to run for office? There's the danger of making these pledges that I will definitely cut taxes, I will definitely build something. You really need to know the numbers before you start making those promises, because what ends up happening is you need to keep those promises for your credibility, and then you start playing games. And that gets to be the worst thing.
Put you on the spot.
Sure.
30 seconds. Your one prediction for 2012. That is putting you on the spot.
Barack Obama is reelected by a surprisingly large number. The Dow Jones average breaks 14,000, and thank goodness a lot of our neighbors get back to work.
Well, that wasn't even hard for you, and you gave us 3. So so we'll have to come back in a year and see how that all looks.
Okay.
I want to thank you for joining us. Lawrence Levy,
Thanks
the
for having
Executive
me.
Dean for the National Center for Suburban Studies at Hofstra University. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having
And
me.
thank you for being there. I'm Richard Rose. Be sure to join us next week for yet another edition of Focus.